It's a story about a woman. Let's call her Mrs. Kowalski. Perhaps she was a retired school teacher. Maybe some of you know her or someone like her. My story says that she made a habit of standing out on her porch every morning, waving to the kids on their way to the bus stop. A sweet, harmless little ritual, almost too quaint to be real. But apparently Mrs. Kowalski was very serious about this waving business. If the kids didn't wave back, she let them know. Don't have a good day, have a great day. Don't forget to do good. Or, hey you, I'm waving over here. She was apparently quite insistent that the kids wave back. And by and large, they did, even the shy ones. We can imagine lots of reasons why Mrs. Kowalski waved. Maybe she was lonely, maybe she missed her classroom, or maybe a few kids in the neighborhood had been bullied so badly that they were afraid to leave their houses. In any case, Mrs. Kowalski made a decision. She'd be out there every morning, a friendly face, demanding those kids and reminding those kids that they weren't alone. Reminding them they weren't alone, that someone was out there watching over them. Now, she didn't fight any bullies, assuming there were any, and there's no version of the story that has Mrs. Kowalski giving any grand speeches. Apparently, she just stood on her porch and waved. I like to imagine that this was a small act of quiet bravery. And I wonder if this isn't where courage begins. Not in a grand gesture, but in the simple decision to show up, to be present, to stand for something. We know that not every challenge is small. Not every bully can be disarmed with a wave and a smile. There are times in history when the stakes are higher, when what's at risk is not just the comfort of the few, but the dignity, freedom, and even humanity of the many. These are the moments that demand more of us, and that's where the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer speaks so powerfully today. Tomorrow is National Holocaust Remembrance Day. And in that spirit, I was inspired to watch a dramatization of Bonhoeffer's life. It was released last year by Angel Studios. Now, those of you who know this studio know that this is not the most unbiased movie studio out there. Many of their releases are, for example, unapologetically Christian apologies, designed to attempt to make Christian teachings make sense. That's kind of their gig. And that's why there was quite a bit of concern in theological circles, and yes, that is totally a thing, theological circles. There was concern that this movie would draw heavily from the recent biography of Eric Metaxas, an evangelical whose best-selling biography of Bonhoeffer probably ought to have been titled, How I Misunderstood Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Happily, it wasn't the case, and while my critique of the movie has more to do with it being kind of boring, from what I know of Bonhoeffer, the basic themes are all there in the film. So while I can't actually recommend it, I am going to recommend against the Metaxas book and just leave that there. Now, as the movie tells us, Bonhoeffer didn't start out a revolutionary. He was born into a wealthy and highly intellectual family in Germany. His father was a psychiatrist, his siblings were scientists, and the Bonhoeffer home was full of debates about art and philosophy and culture. When a teenage Dietrich decided to dedicate his life to the church, this was not okay. It was a puzzling surprise, you might say. After completing his doctorate in Germany, Bonhoeffer enrolled at Union Seminary. He was apparently planning on being an academic and just going to school forever. And for the record, I am very sympathetic to this kind of plan. Anyway, this was 1930, and while he was in New York, he attended a vibrant black congregation in Harlem. He discovered firsthand senseless hate and the stupidity of American racism. He discovered a church community that was alive with music and justice and resistance. And the movie suggests that this is where Bonhoeffer fell in love with the idea of a faith that didn't just speak of love, it acted on it. That vision stayed with him when he returned to Germany. But when Bonhoeffer returned in 1931, Germany was changing rapidly. Adolf Hitler had risen to power, and the Nazi regime was transforming every institution, including the church. Hitler had actually installed his very own puppet bishop, and many church leaders fell in line with this new regime's doctrine of racial hatred and violence. Bonhoeffer couldn't stay silent. He publicly denounced the Nazi corruption of Christianity and his German church. This marked him as a troublemaker, a dangerous voice in dangerous times. He fled to England for a time, where he helped draft the Barmen Declaration, the founding document of what became called the Confessing Church, which outlined in theological terms what it meant to resist Nazi interference in the life and teachings of Jesus. When he returned to Germany, Bonhoeffer established an underground seminary to train dissident pastors who rejected Nazi ideology. One of his colleagues at that seminary, Martin Niemöller, wrote the poem that I shared at the opening. The movie takes more than a few liberties with timing and events. It was only 2 hours. But as I said, the general story is close enough. And what we know is that right around this time, this seminary time, his brother-in-law introduced him to a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. This caused immense conflict with the young theologian. The Gospels are rather clear. A true disciple of Christ ought to be willing to die, but not to kill. And familiar with Gandhi's practical example of nonviolence, assassination stood at odds to the gospel. But Bonhoeffer came around, and he concluded that, quote, "We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." As we know, the attempt to kill Hitler failed, but the investigations that followed that attempt did lead to Bonhoeffer's arrest and imprisonment. In 1945, just weeks before the Allied forces liberated the camp where he was held, Bonhoeffer was executed. He was 39 years old. There are a couple of ideas I want to lift up this morning, drawing on his pre-arrest writings, not the advocacy for assassination. I'm going to just be clear about that. But the heart of Bonhoeffer's work at this time was a discussion of grace. For those of you who did not spend their youth in Christian Sunday school, or even worse, went to some heretic church that teaches that such ideas are fundamentally flawed, grace cannot be earned by good deeds. Instead, grace is the freely given gift available to all, the gift from God that brings salvation in the life to come. To put it bluntly, grace is the only reason we sinners are even able to hope for heaven. But cheap grace, Bonhoeffer wrote, is, quote, grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. To be clear, Bonhoeffer was saying cheap grace was what the church offered, very particularly the Nazi church of 1937 Germany, and cheap grace is worthless. Costly grace, on the other hand, does not flow from the doctrines of the church or any church. It flows from God. And costly grace demands something of us. It requires sacrifice, courage, and action. Costly grace is the pearl of great price, that highest of human aspiration, that ultimate aim of life and love and good. Costly grace has infinite value and infinite cost. For Bonhoeffer, costly grace is exactly what it means to follow the teachings and example of Jesus. And that is not simple, not easy, not comforting, not feel good, and certainly has nothing to do with nationalism. Costly grace, especially given the way the world is, might take everything from you, including your life. And that is the cost of discipleship. It's tempting to look at Bonhoeffer's story and ideas and think, well, that was another time. That was another place. That was Germany, 1930s. No relevance for today. But how do we know, right? Even if we laugh, how do we know? How do we know that this moment right now isn't asking something of us? And if it is, how are we going to respond? Eric Metaxas, the Bonhoeffer hijacker I mentioned earlier, would be quick to tell you that liberals trade the costly grace of evangelical truth and the wise teaching of conservative policies for the cheap grace of identity politics and DEI hand-waving. And just to be clear, Bonhoeffer gets a lot of airtime in those circles. Apparently, everyone is eager to claim him as their own personal martyr. Now, for the record, serious scholars agree that Metaxas was deliberately rewriting history. And instead, they say that the real Bonhoeffer might have sounded like Bishop Marianne Booty, speaking this past week from her pulpit, her own pulpit, at the National Cathedral. And that if given the chance, Bonhoeffer would probably have aggravated our new commander-in-chief more than twice as much and probably been less than half as nice. And that's kind of why his example stands out to me. That's why when I see leaders stoking fear, targeting the vulnerable, and consolidating powers that should make us pause, if not shout out loud, Bonhoeffer's warning rings true. He said, quote, "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." Yeah. The choice between ideals and beliefs and values on one hand and between safety on the other, that's called a Bonhoeffer moment. My question is not whether we'll recognize that moment if it comes. It's whether we'll be ready. Bonhoeffer's story is sad and inspiring and awful. He had to make decisions that I believe were impossible to make. No one should ever have to make decisions like this. It was not right and it was not fair. But I do wonder, what would I have done? Would I have stood at a pulpit and preached mercy and defiance to Nazi officers? Would I have marched in Selma with Martin Luther King and John Lewis when the fire hoses and dogs came out? Would I have stood with the trans folks during the Stonewall riots, even as the police charged with clubs and guns? Would I have hidden a whole family in my attic when ICE came for them? Would I have been there? Would I have shown up? Would I have had the courage to shout defiance in the face of a tiki torch carrying Nazi sympathizer in Charlottesville? I want to say yes. I think most of us want to say yes. And maybe that's true. But the truth is, courage isn't theoretical. It's something we discover only in the doing. And here's the thing. The forces of injustice aren't just history. As we've seen in the news this very week, those forces are on the way. And so the question becomes, what will you do? Your Bonhoeffer moment, if it ever comes, may sneak in the back door, asking little questions. Questions like, will you speak up? Will you refuse to comply when injustice happens right in front of you? Will you call out the lie, even if someone shouts you down? Will you stand, even if you are alone? Maybe you will. But I want to tell you today that great courage is not always born of great moments. Perhaps it's a good thing, but I believe courage is born in the small things. Small acts of kindness and care, attention and compassion. I believe that courage can be cultivated over time. I believe it grows with success and with failure. I believe courage grows mostly with practice. Practice makes perfect. And that's a good thing because when the big moments do come, we need to be ready. Because that is also my fear, that there will be many moments, small and big, all of which will be very much worthy of our practice in the coming years. My friends, I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could tell you that everything is going to be fine. This is what my conservative friends keep telling me, and I pray they are right. But I know that thoughts and prayers are only as useful as seeds to action. They were never meant to be a replacement for it. So I'm going to ask you to practice with me small acts of bravery. It's not too late to start. So as I turn to the close, I want you to do me a favor. Look around you. I can see you. Yes, just turn to your neighbors. My friends, this sanctuary and thousands of others like it all across this country are filled with people like you. Good, hopeful, flag-waving, God-fearing people. You may have fears, but never fear that you are alone. And that's what I want us to leave with today. I want us to leave this place not just with a story, hope, promise of someone else's courage, but with a seed to grow our own. Let us therefore resolve to stand even when the winds of indifference batter us, to speak even when silence is safer, to resist even when resistance seems futile, to act even when the cost is high. We are called to be more than bystanders in history's unfolding. We are called to be the voice that shouts no to injustice. the hand that reaches out in love, the soul that refuses to yield humanity to hatred. We are called to defy fear, defy apathy, defy despair. Because courage is not a gift given only to saints. It is not reserved for the heroes of books or the martyrs of history. It is a choice, a daily, deliberate act of faith in the goodness that we must create. If this is our moment, our Bonhoeffer moment, then in this moment, let us remember what our ancestors have taught us. They have taught us that we do not yield to the shadows, for this is our light to carry. We do not yield to hate, for love is our shared inheritance. We do not yield to hopelessness, for hope is our sacred work. You are not alone. You stand in a long line of ancestors and among a great crowd of friends. Know that those of your faith have always been counted among the brave. They are the builders of justice, the guardians of truth, and the champions of love, truth, and progress. And though the road ahead may demand much of you, know this one thing for certain, that this is the only road worth traveling. Together, we will defy the darkness. Together, we will carry the light of truth. Together, we will love the hell out of this world. And we will do these things with the unshakable conviction that justice must have the final word. Together, we will do all of these things because that is our story. That is who we are. That is who we have always been called to be. Amen.
Visit us at UUSG.org.